Perfect. All right, well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Food Systems Leadership Network's online training, Make Yourself Obsolete, Shifting Power from Nonprofit Leadership to Community Leadership. I'm Annalena Kazikas with the Wallace Center and helping to facilitate today's call. We had almost 600 people register for today's session, or this two-part training. And it looks like we have almost 150 already trickling in. So that's awesome. Clearly a very hot topic. So thank all of you so much for being here and sharing part of your day with us. We are really looking forward to this session today with Miles and Jen of Kitchen Table Consulting. So please do use the chat box at the bottom of your toolbar to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're calling in from. Always a good place to get acquainted. So Make Yourself Obsolete is a two-part training. Today is session 1. Next week will be session 2. The training is led by Jen Dalton and Miles Gordon of Kitchen Table Consulting, and each session is an hour and a half. All sessions will be recorded and archived on the FSLN website. Before we get started, we just have a few Zoom tech tips to share with you today. On the bottom left of your screen is the Zoom control panel where you'll see the option to mute, turn your video on or off, and manage your audio and how to use the chat box. Please do remain muted for this session until the breakout groups or the Q&A, but definitely use the chat box for introductions, questions, comments, etc. Should you have any issues with any of the tech, my colleague Andrew Carberry and I are both here to help, so feel free to use the chat box to just directly message us. All right, so like I mentioned, this training is hosted by the Wallace Center's Food Systems Leadership Network, the FSLN. The FSLN is a national peer learning community of almost 3,000 food systems leaders from across the country. We connect current and emerging leaders, strengthen individual and collective leadership capacity, and foster collaboration across communities with the goal of accelerating the realization of a just, equitable, and sustainable food system. The FSLN offers a variety of leadership development and organizational capacity building trainings. The Nonprofit Bootcamp e-learning series, which this training is part of, is a collection of webinars and online courses that share the nuts and bolts strategies and best practices in nonprofit management and operations. So all the courses are recorded and archived on our website, and if you're not already a member, we'll send a link with more information and instructions for joining after this call. This is an awesome community to tap into for technical and leadership support and to just build a network of peers. So we really hope that you'll join us. So today, we're going to be joined by Jen Dalton and Miles Gordon of Kitchen Table Consulting for this two-part session on shifting power from nonprofit leadership to community leadership. We're so excited to have such stellar trainers with us today. So thank you both so much for being here.
Great. It's so great to see so many people too.
Can I just say a little bit more about Jen and Miles? Jen and Miles both bring over 2 decades of food systems development and community engagement work as program director.
You muted yourself, Annalena.
All right, good to go?
Yep.
Cool. All right, well, quickly, Jen and Miles bring over 2 decades of food systems development and community engagement work as program directors, working for a variety of nonprofit organizations, and a wealth of expertise, including in leadership development, multi-stakeholder engagement, and group facilitation. They work at the local, regional, national, and international levels with clients engaged in community empowerment, organizational leadership, sustainable communities, systems development, and change implementation. They're close partners of the Wallace Center and the FSLN, with Miles serving as an FSLN mentor and the 2 of them hosting various conference sessions, including the session that today's training is adapted from. So Jen and Miles, thanks again, and I will hand it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much. And like I said, it's really great to see so many familiar faces and new faces and the amount of kind of energy and excitement around this topic, because it's really key as we move into this from talk to action stage.
So hi, I'm Jen, and I should make sure my mic was attached there. I just want to say too, it's so wonderful to see people from all over the country gathered today and having, and we also have someone I think here from Puerto Rico. And just as Annalena said, this is a great community, and we're really grateful to be in conversation with you today. Before we get started, Miles and I wanted to share with you a little bit about our guiding premise, our guiding frame, how we approach the work that we do, who we are, in addition to the description of who we are that Annalena shared. You know, we're very passionate about justice and equity for all beings, and the work that we do is, a lot of it has been informed by the work that we've been doing for anti-poverty organizations and engaged in food systems work through that lens. And we are also anti-racist, and we admit that we have some blind spots, you know, as we're all engaging in more direct conversations about racism in our country. We're constantly learning new things, and we're grateful to be aware of those blind spots as we see them. We're also complicit in the system, specifically because we are white, cisgendered human beings. We benefit from the current system. We also like to think of ourselves as accomplices in working to change the system. And when we say accomplice, what we really mean is that we're willing to give up our power. We're also willing to explore what that looks like. We're willing to take risks and get our hands dirty and work with our neighbors and friends to shift the system as it exists. And we want to share that the work that we're going to be exploring today, while not rocket science and definitely built around like a framework for viewing things, is based on our personal observations and the work that we've been doing and our experiences.
So definitions. When you hear us say the words we and us, we're talking about Miles and Jen. Now you might find that there's commonalities, and we're hoping that you do, and you're able to take this and put this in your own perspective. But to understand, when we use those words we and us, it's us. As Jen said, we're cisgendered white people. And the examples we share are from the communities and nonprofits where we work, have worked in Northern California and across the nation. And just speaking of Northern California, something to be aware of right now as I look outside, we're living in kind of an apocalyptic zone right now. It's supposed to be 103 today. There's winds, there's red flag warnings. You can't see more than 100 yards because of the smoke. And there's a chance that the power could be shut off. So as something that you know, if we disappear for a moment, we're going to call in on our phones, and Annalena will keep the slides going. So be patient as we work through this, and we're hoping that everything is good on many levels today.
So why are we here today? So what is the big objective of this conversation? Well, to put it simply, it's to shift or affirm your program and or project design thinking to be community driven. And what do we mean by that too? I mean, it's really just about the fact that we are, you know, wanting to challenge ourselves to move towards, as Miles mentioned earlier, that action over just talking about things, and moving from language to a structure change. And to get there, as I said, we've got this boot camp for 2 days. Today, we're really going to be setting the stage. We're going to be talking about a lot of concepts. We're going to talk about what we need to acknowledge and release. We're going to be talking about a 4-part process on how to shift power and still continue to fulfill on our missions. And next week, when we meet, we're going to really take those concepts and look at how they are applied in communities, how they show up in the work that we do. And we're going to share 3 examples, one from a food hub, community gardens, and also farm to school program. And then we're going to look at your program. So we're going to give everyone an opportunity next week to really dive into, like, well, how does all of this apply to what we're doing? And we're going to have a worksheet for that. And the process today and next week are going to be a little bit presentation, a little bit participation. We're going to be using the chat box. We're going to have some breakout rooms. And we hope you just kind of follow along, and hopefully the power doesn't go out. But again, it's really about, you know, challenging ourselves to kind of stop just kind of being in our heads about stuff and taking action out in the world. So that's really going to be our focus today. And when we say that action, it's really about how are we shifting that power from nonprofit leadership to community leadership, and what does that look like? So we've gotten a sense of where everyone's from in the country, and as a part of the United States, it seems like everyone's United States based here. But we'd like to hear, like, what kind of work are you doing out there in the world? So Annalena, can you confirm for me that when we do this poll, people can check as many that apply, or can they just pick one?
I'm actually going to pass that question to Andrew. Andrew, mind chiming in on that?
Sure, yeah, I'll launch the poll now, and it's multiple choice, so you can select more than one, I believe.
Great, so if you guys wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to let us know what kind of work you're doing out there in the world. Obviously, check as many as apply to you.
Exciting.
I know. And if you're an other, if you could share with us in the chat box, like, what is that other? And maybe an other is also in addition to something that is listed here. So we're hearing transportation, national nonprofit, other governmental agencies, mutual aid support. It's flying by. Food councils, yes, sorry, we didn't put that in there. Nutrition and cooking programs. Farmers market manager, thank you. Zooming, food co-op, great.
Great.
Okay.
I'm glad to
End the poll here, and I can share with you.
yeah, let's see where we're at.
Results.
So looks like the big winner here is food security, food bank, emergency food, which is obviously a really important topic.
I'm really happy to see funders, the funders that are here. There's a specific part, you know, that you're going to be playing in this role of shifting power. So it's really glad to see funders in the group today.
Great. And thank you everyone for sharing me. So what we want for you guys to take away from this, like, who's here piece, is that what we're sharing and the frameworks that we're sharing is really applicable to everything. So, and it's, you know, it's applicable to our food systems community, but it's also just applicable to any kind of community work that's going on out there. So thank you all for the work that you're doing and for being a part of this community.
Great, so let's dive on into a little bit more deeply about not only what sector you represent, but I want everybody who's on here, and there's a lot of you, to take a moment and self-reflect. And do this, and I'd like you to answer this in the chat box with 1 to 3 words of why you got into the work you're doing. You know, what is it? This is hard work. So what is it that motivates you each day to just get out of bed and go to the work? Is it, you know, fighting for get rid of hunger in my community, stop poverty, racial justice? What is it? So just get a sense that if people can start throwing some things in the chat box about what it is that motivates you.
Yeah, some food equity. I love eating and hate injustice. Food sovereignty, healthy food, community equity, food systems planning, justice, feeding kids, diet-related diseases, land is life, human health, transformation, reclaiming our power, resilience, justice, movement building, food is a basic need, caring about people through food. Zip code shouldn't determine health. Yeah. Hunger
Great.
Coalition.
Great to know. If you're looking at the chat box, if you're able to open that up and see that or hear what Jen's sharing, I want you to think about your own. This is basically your mission for your work, and often that's, you know, the same mission of an organization you might be working for. And I'm going to stretch you a little bit here, and I want you to sit with me and see how this plays out. But if you think about it, if you were to successfully fulfill this mission of why you get out of bed, be it food justice, being, you know, eliminating hunger, making sure all kids are fed equitably, if that's the goal of your work and you accomplish that work, or you make great strides towards it, you should simultaneously not need to do that work anymore, or at least be planning for success. Too often we just plan like, oh, this is just what I do. And we don't think that if I reach this goal, if I fulfill these things I just wrote, then I'm not going to be needed anymore. And so our framing today is really to take you and say, if these are your missions, this is what gets you out of bed, this is what motivates you, you should also simultaneously be planning for some levels of success with that, which means you need to plan for yourself to move out of the process. So that's really the framing we're going to be going with today. And a lot of you might be scratching your head saying, yeah, how's that work? So stick with us as we kind of move into that. So what that first means is we need to acknowledge and release certain things that we bring to our work. There's internal and external conditioning, which creates certain mindsets internally, and we're going to talk about those. And also we inherit a lot of structures in our communities and in our work and in our organizations that were there when we walked through the door of our organization and we accepted them. So we have to acknowledge those first and say, oh, right. And then we have to release those in order to make the shift. So let's talk about what we bring. I'm going to start with internal conditions. And again, I'm going to give my personal confession. This is where I'm coming from, but I think you're going to see some things we're hoping that are relevant for you also. Privilege is a big one. You know, I'm your average white guy. You know, I have a lot of privilege. I walk into a room and I have a certain amount of power. I bring that to the table. It's there. It's, you know, it's just what I bring to the table. Now, I want you to think, what are the privileges you bring to the table? It might be similar. It might be different. I mean, you're attending this workshop right now. That's a real privilege. Not everybody can do this and stop and say, yeah, let me just think about the big picture, how I do my work. Maybe most of you might be being paid. You might be being on paid time to do that. That's a privilege in its own right that maybe others in your community don't have. And then ego is huge. We all have an ego. And, you know, recognition. When my mama calls me on the phone and says, I saw you in the paper, Miles, doing that great project, I love it. It feels good. You know, I made my mom proud. And it makes me feel proud. There's an ego in there. It feels good to be in charge of a project. I mean, it's nice to know that, hey, this is me. In my door, it has my title of my office. This is what I do. I'm in charge of these things. You know, I help run those community gardens. You know, hey, success. We all like to claim success. It's just, there's nothing that's inherently bad about this, but we have to acknowledge it. And moving up in positions, maybe you started, you know, recently or decades ago as a volunteer or a Vista, and then you became a program coordinator, and then you became a program manager, and now you're an ED, or you're thinking about what's next. And because, you know, that's just what we do, and I have to think about my income stability. I need to make more money so I can pay my rent, do the things I want. These all are things that we bring to our work, and they all help restrain us from letting go of power because they feel good and they give us the opportunity to do things. So we really need to acknowledge those before we start shifting. So I want you to take that idea, and we're going to jump into a breakout room in a minute here, but I want you to really reflect on yourself, and then if you're comfortable sharing with a group of people, what privilege do you bring to your work? I mean, when you're in your work, and what's the ego? How does it manifest itself in your work when you do it? So as you think about that, there's a couple of things when we throw you into these breakout groups. If you haven't been in them at Zoom, we're going to on the back end put you into a group of people, about 7 to 10 people. You'll have to accept it. And when you get there, I want you to respect other people's perspectives. If they're comfortable sharing, you don't have to challenge them. You don't have to talk back, just listen and say, huh, that's interesting. I want you to be brief when you share, so you give others time. You're gonna only have 10 minutes for this. I want you to respect confidentiality. Some people might be being vulnerable to share. We're talking about those things that we, you know, our internal selves. And this is for this workshop, for us to have that opportunity to share, listen, learn, but it's not to share beyond this space. And at the beginning, somebody can either volunteer or say, hey, can you just be willing to, if we call on you, to report out 1 or 2 key takeaways from your discussion, so other people, we can do a little cross-sharing. So what privilege or ego do you bring to your work? Jen, did you want to add something before they jump in?
Well, I just wanted to say, I guess it's implied that these are not facilitated breakout rooms, that you're on your own.
Yeah, so please make room to share amongst each other, and you will be given about a 1-minute warning saying to finish up, so make sure anybody who has a opportunity or wants to talk has that opportunity. Okay, so what privilege or ego do you bring to your work that you're going to have to release? Ready? Let's go in. Andrew and Alina, if you'd like to take everybody into their breakout groups. And we've never done it with this many people, I don't think, so let's keep our fingers crossed that Zoom can handle this many breakout rooms.
All right, we'll launch the breakout rooms right now and give you guys about a 1-minute warning just when time's running low. So you should be getting a prompt soon and just click accept and you'll get sent to your room.
Great, got everybody coming back. Give another moment. Is everybody back yet, or are we still waiting another moment, you think, here?
I think we still have people trickling back in.
We'll wait another moment. Welcome back.
It's officially about 20 seconds until they all get kicked out of breakout rooms, which is the most abrupt part of Zoom, but c'est la vie.
Yep. Okay. Welcome back, people. People are trickling in. We're almost joining back as a whole group. We'll be there in a moment. Great. Still got folks coming. Okay, so we had a few new people join in, but welcome if you have just joined. So I know the breakout rooms, again, we're working with technology. Maybe not everybody had the chance to talk or you got cut off. And I'm going to encourage, we're going to have another breakout room. If you didn't have a chance to speak, and if you did speak, maybe wait and let others who didn't have a chance speak the next time. But I want to take a moment and just harvest a little bit of, so we can kind of just get some different ideas about what was shared as far as talking about, you know, the kind of ego power and privilege we just bring to the work that we need to acknowledge. So in the bottom of your participant, you either have a raise hand, or if you want to do a reaction where you do like a clapping hand or a thumbs up. If you were the person for your breakout group that was going to share away just 1 or 2 brief takeouts, so we can just do a little popcorning around and hear what was shared. We're going to try and look at all the screens here and be able to do that. All right, I see Samika, let's see. Why don't you go ahead and share out a couple of things. And hi, Samika, good to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you also and good to be here. Yeah, so in our group, we mostly discussed the ability of that this is a choice, that we are choosing to be doing this work, and most of us are getting paid to do this work. It's not our lifestyle. We have the option to walk away from this work when we want to. You know, we obviously need space, and mental health is important for us, but we have that option. It's, again, not our lifestyle. We also touched on housing security. A lot of us, and myself included, have never experienced housing, physical housing insecurity at least, and that plays a huge role in food security. And lastly, I think a lot of people resonated with that, you know, we grew up, or we haven't experienced food insecurity directly. We are working with communities that experience that, but that's not one of our concerns in our lives.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of privilege that we hold in these spaces. Leah, rapidly, do you want to share? I see you want to unmute and share for your group 1 or 2 key takeaways. You got to unmute there. There you go. Nope, you're still muted. That's on your bottom. You see where that is? There we go.
We both keep clicking it, and so it undoes what the other person did.
Go ahead.
Hello! Delightful Zoom issues. Yeah, so we talked about a lot of things, a couple of themes that came up aside from race, which is obviously a big one, being white, having immense privilege. And, you know, white passing, even if you're not white, can also confer privileges of being white. A couple others were about education, in terms of the privilege it brings and some of the ego it may create. And also kind of the benefits to having grown up in or lived for a while in the place where you work, either just from a kind of knowing the area, or in some cases having more trust of the community as a result.
Great. Yeah, education, that's a key one too. That's really important. Sometimes we bring a lot of that, you know, we've got those titles next to our name, and what's that? It feels good, and it also brings a certain privilege when you walk into a space. Julia Taylor, could you want to unmute and share 1 or 2 takeaways about ego and privilege from your group?
Sure.
we had very similar conversations to what's been shared so far: education, race, the ability to do this kind of work. In terms of ego, we talked a lot about the desire for action and desire for things to work out well, and how do we ensure that things work out well, and sometimes that desire makes it difficult for us to give up power or let things run their course. So that was really it.
Okay, yeah.
Some of it anyway.
Great, thank you. Joe, is it Crater? You want to go ahead and unmute and share one or two things from your group, and then we'll probably do one more group after that.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, kind of picking up where what Julia was talking about. We were kind of talking towards the end about the relationship between ego and fear, and how, fear really is such a motivator for us to want to continue to be, kind of entrenched in our organizations and within our programs. And, having that difficulty of letting go, not because of, oh my God, we want the glory, but sort of about what happens, after we leave. What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is absolutely, and that comes from that income stability often, and what's my next role? If I'm getting out of this, what happens next? We'll do one more. I think the only other one I see is Justin Smith. Justin, do you want to share from your group one or two takeaways?
Sure. Yeah, we discussed a lot of the same things, especially some people touched on education and the privilege of not having been food insecure or dealing with hunger. And then we were also talking about a privilege a lot of people bring into just nonprofit work or governmental work in that space in general, which is kind of the privilege of kind of bringing this element of saviorism or kind of paternalism to the work that you do, and even being able to do good work while having that attitude. But in the scope of like this webinar, that makes it that much more difficult to, do real work and to be able to hand that work over to a community if you see yourself in that position of power or the power dynamic in that way.
Great, and that's a good segue to the section we're going to hit here next. And I just want to say, there was in the chat box too, that idea of also another privilege that was talked about in a group is working for relatively low wages at nonprofits. Not everybody can do that, and that's a privilege you can do. It's not necessarily how I see a lot of recognition of that. So certain privileges. So as we kind of move forward and thinking about shifting power, we have to acknowledge that we do have these egos and we do have these privileges that we bring into it. So I want to switch now to where the last comment, a little bit about that, that white savior idea of where we go, and that is acknowledging and releasing some of the external conditions that we have inherited. So Jen, you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. So you can probably just bring up that white savior one first if you want.
There you go.
We've already talked about it. So we really want to talk now about some of these external conditions. So we've reviewed some of the internal ones, and it's not an inclusive list, and the internal one was an inclusive list. This is not an inclusive list, but it's just kind of a flavor of it. But these are these structures that were built on white supremacy and the supremacy of capital over people. And it's kind of like we're the fish in the water, right? I mean, I think as a society, we're starting to have more and more conversations about these things, but, they were created long before we were born. They come from, storytelling and cultural things, but the majority of them are built on the structures, are built on white supremacy and the supremacy of capital over people. So we're going to just go through a couple of those, and everyone mentioned one. For me, it's the white savior complex. So I think that I kind of picked this up in church, growing up in a church where, it's like, it's the idea of like, oh, I see these people, I need to go help. I want to go help. I'm someone who has a compassionate heart. Therefore, I want to go out there and do good in the world, but it kind of continues to feed my ego. But there's this idea too, is if I'm coming to save someone, it implies that they can't save themselves. And so that's just kind of something to think about. Then there's the gender structures. So I think we can probably all agree the dominant structure that our culture is based on is that masculine structure. It's hierarchical. So we see this obviously in our nonprofits, in the org chart, or in our desire to get to that next step in our careers or whatever. Whereas a feminine structure or a non-gendered structure could potentially look more flowy, more like collaborative work, more, you know, like, yeah, like I just said, kind of like going the flow and allowing things to come in, or just being more in that kind of gathering sort of mindset of like information and seeing where it pieces together, and more trust. Our grant structures and the similarity between a capitalist structure is kind of clear, especially the fact that we have to compete for these, for grants. We're all out there trying to do similar work, and yet we're trying to figure out what are the buzzwords for this year and how can I like get my application to the top of the pile. And then when we're doing all the paperwork, you know, everything is measured in money or numbers and returns on investment. So we're not really given an opportunity to say, oh, look, we've been really successful with building community, or these relationships have formed and it's starting to plant some seeds around this and this, or even valuing cultural knowledge. There are no boxes for those things, and they're not necessarily valued because the value is kind of comes more from that capitalist structure. And that we're often, you know, in the line of competition, we're often saying like, oh, I can accomplish this in, you know, a year's time, when we sort of know in the back of our heads that this might be more of a generational shift or something that happens over 10 years or 5 years, but we're trying to squeeze in this progress or this perfection into this like time frame and create some outcome that sometimes is, and usually is, an outcome that we're designing based on what the grant is asking us to design, and not inclusive of what the community is really wanting, or it wouldn't be necessarily the process that would be used to arrive at that outcome. And bureaucracy. So we all know, you know, I mean, I've been involved in grant projects where I'm like, okay, so I'm just getting paid to like shuffle some paper here and fill out a bunch of reports, when like I could be out there in the community, you know, engaging with people. Instead, I'm, you know, on massive meetings, and, you know, it's all about quantity over quality. It's like, you know, how many people came to a meeting? How many, you know, did I meet those measures that I set out for myself? And if I didn't, am I a massive failure? And, you know, kind of brings in that, you know, how the fact that there's just, again, there's no way to measure the importance of relationship building and community building in most of the grants that, especially around food systems, that I've experienced working in. And this whole framework can be really seen as, you know, what we can call the nonprofit industrial complex. And this system was built to maintain, you know, the power in the nonprofits, because it was created around the same structure as, you know, the supremacy of capital over people. So it wasn't necessarily built for the transfer of power to the community. So if, when we go back to like the, why do we get out of bed in the morning? Why do we do this work? If we want to reach those goals, this is not a structure that's there, that's is a framework for us to get there. And so if it's not, then what kind of revolutionary conversations, what kind of structures do we need to be creating? What kind of conversations do we need to be having so that we're creating the structures that support the work we want to do in the world? And that is where we're going to be going as we talk about moving from concepts into action. Miles, is there anything you want to add?
Nope.
Okay. So we're going to move into another breakout. I know I talked a little quickly, but we want to give everyone time to reflect on this. As someone just wrote, the competitiveness of funding streams often leads to trying to fit square pegs into round holes. Exactly. So we want you guys to have a conversation with one another about, you know, what structures and our cultures have you inherited that you know, it's within the water experience, and how do they show up in your work? And I also want you to kind of think about, and you can share, where do they come from? You know, as I was sharing, I think this white savior thing for me is about the culture of the church and like, you know, being a good person out there in the world, as someone else mentioned, but from kind of more of this like paternalistic / you know, well, they can't help themselves viewpoint, which I've really had to grow out of and start waking up to. So please follow the same guidelines as the last one. These are non-facilitated breakouts because we have so many people. So we just invite you to listen, to share. If you didn't get a chance to talk last time and you really want to talk, please do that. If we would love for someone to volunteer to kind of share out from the group, maybe when you first arrive into the group, say, I'm happy to be the person to share out or whatever. And then to just, maintain confidentiality. Again, we're building community here, and that means, building trust amongst one another. So with that, Andrew or Annalena, the other thing I want to share with you guys is that you can be in the same groups so that you were in last time. So that will help with getting to know one another and all of that. So are we ready to head into those breakouts?
Yep, I will open them up right now, and you all have about 10 minutes.
Great. And if you're comfortable sharing in the chat box, do it there too.
Great. So for those of you who just joined too, we're going to be doing some popcorn share out. So for those of you who would like to share what the discussion, just a couple of key takeaways from your discussion in your breakout room, would you please raise your hand? Oh, Joe, I saw you raise your hand. Just happened to be on my screen. Would you like to share?
Sure, I realized.
You can use the raise your hand little icon at the bottom of your screen, but Joe, you just happened to actually raise your human hand, and I saw it.
I realized that as I did it. I was like, there's a feature for that. In our group, we talked about a couple of things. We talked about how a savior complex pops up in volunteer groups, and that shows up in the language that we use, which sort of sets up a hierarchy over people that we serve. We talked about the pressures of capitalism to be productive and how that dilutes the work that we do. Talked about what do we celebrate successful programs? Is it actually a good thing that so many people are dependent on SNAP? And how, what we celebrate is maybe needs to be looked at. Talked about how we don't necessarily pay people for their time when we study them. And try to help them. And what was the last one? Oh, and that in the context of disasters, local organizations who are often the most able to get the job done can't get funded by large funders. Only large donors can receive funds, and how that is like a power dynamic there.
Great. Thank you so much. And one thing I'd mention as people were coming back in the room, that if you have an opportunity to kind of scroll through the chat, there was a really great conversation going on around reframing the word help and how, framing it as solidarity or just, looking at that languaging is definitely a really important part of the conversation, which you mentioned. Caitlin, you are next on my list. Caitlin Matthews, would you like to share?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, our group had a great conversation, and several of the things were tied together by the concept of time. So we had a Latina member of our group reflect on sort of, she said she had no concept of time growing up, and then went into the military, and that concept of time was really strictly reinforced, and that in her work now in the community, she has a different expectation than some of her colleagues around when people might arrive at an event. But that concept of time also, several of us reflected on some of the characteristics of white supremacy in the workplace, specifically the sense of urgency, and how during this pandemic, as many of us have gone virtual on the one hand, but also that our community needs have increased, we have an even greater sense of urgency that can really just run us into the ground, be exhausting, reach a place where we have trouble distinguishing between like what's truly urgent versus what is the expectation or the demand on us. And that sense of urgency and the quantity over quality can kind of be mutually reinforcing. So another member of our group also just really reflected on centralizing the importance of rest in our work and shared the resource of the NAP ministry. There were others, but that was kind of what held it all together.
That's awesome. I'm definitely a disciple of the NAP ministry. And just, you know, I know for myself, I've had to unravel, and I'm still doing it, what time looks like and how that, and I moved from a city to a rural place. And then there's that concept of time. And it's such a cool thing to engage in, that unraveling of the concept. So thank you for sharing that and everything else that you shared. Lacey Frownfelter, you've raised your hand. Would you like to share from your group?
Sure, thanks. And Caitlin, I also just want to say thank you for that focus on rest and the sense of urgency. That's something that I see pop up a lot in my work as well. So I really appreciate that. In our group, we more broadly just talked about whiteness and the power that we hold, as I think the majority of us are white people. And so in our nonprofit areas, we have really unique individual experiences, but collectively they're very similar. Again, mostly white, you know, college educated with the opportunity to receive all these certificates, and are very well-meaning white women and think that we know what's best for these communities. And even in times when we are doing proper community engagement and think that we get it right, there's just this set of external conditions that are influencing equity in the sector.
Thank you for that. We'll take a couple more. How about Alice Evans?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I feel like one of the threads that kind of tied together a lot of what our group was talking about, we talked a lot about grants, both in terms of like the sort of cultural exclusivity of grants, whether that's like academic language or just like institutional knowledge of how to get grants, kind of burden of the grant, like managing grants themselves and how much that kind of limits the work, and then just like, yeah, the work being driven by funders. I know at least in our organization, we try to like have a culture of really emphasizing relationship building, but like nobody wants to fund that. And it also, I think, ties into the conversation earlier about kind of pace. You know, approaching things at the pace of relationships is often not very well fundable. And so sort of trying to balance like organizational sustainability with like what we know to be sort of the true value of the work and like the true work itself. And I think in there, we also talked a little bit about kind of racial and class segregation of like, even when we're trying to be sort of inclusive of diverse communities in our midst, like because our society is so segregated, that can be hard sometimes, like just to cross those lines and reach out to people that you maybe know exist, but they're like not in your lived experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Miles, do we have time for one more?
Sure, it's a brief one.
Yeah, so Sam Wetzel is next on the list. Would you like to share, Sam?
Sure, thank you. I don't want to repeat anything that folks have already said, so I think that the piece of the puzzle that our group would have to add to this is in addition to kind of the nature of philanthropy, where funders get to dictate our work, the entire sector of philanthropy being based on a system where rich people get to decide what is important for us to work on, how we're going to fund it, and then, you know, avoid paying taxes so that we don't need many of the direct services that our organizations provide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that into the space. All right, well, Miles, do you want to?
Well, I'm just going to say, you know, it's what I'm hearing from people, it's almost like it's a confessional time. I mean, for a lot of folks, I'm sure there's this moment of, aha, that's right. And for others, it's like, finally, I can talk about these things that are just, you know, constraining, or that I feel that just are out of whack with our intentions and our inner selves. So that's the intention of this section, is to really like, let's acknowledge this stuff. It's there. So let's talk about it. Let's name it. And then how do we release that to start shifting our structure? And that's what I really want to move into now. This is kind of a zone that we can talk a lot about. And I hope you continue these conversations. But I really want to move into this idea of reframing. Now, how do we reframe the work we do? And there's some great stuff going on in the chat. I'm going to call on some of that too as we go forward and highlight some of those things. So I just want to call that out for folks to keep putting your great ideas out there. So if we're going to reframe and get away from these structures and internal things we've inherited. We have to embrace a community-driven process and the outcomes of that process. So what does that look like first? Well, we know we have to do this in a political and spiritual manner. So politically, that means we have to be intentional. You know, this isn't going to happen unless we're really intentional about what we do, to make those empowering spaces and to release our own ownership. And it's spiritual in the sense that we got to breathe this in. I mean, when we're talking ego can manifest itself in political ways, but it's about our spirit. And to be able to integrate into this zone of like, what do I have to let go of? And what trust do I need to embrace? That if I do this, it's going to move into that community sphere and everything's going to be better or okay with me. And what that looks like is facilitating. We talked about gender structures of hierarchy, you know, that masculine structure, which is the top. I walk into a room, everybody looks at me for answers. When there's a problem, everybody goes to the nonprofit for answers. That's a top of hierarchy. We want to shift that into that more feminine gender structure, that more collaborative horizontal structure, where we're facilitating, where we're actually helping bring people together and have their own conversations and their own resources. And we're going to really dive into that deeply in a moment. And then knowing that this is a continually designing process. This doesn't just happen once. Okay, I did it, great, it's done. You know, we're continually designing this process to create those spaces, to make sure that communities have the choices, the resources, and the skills to fulfill their values. And we're going to dive into that again. And knowing that this is the long game. This doesn't just go away after the 1-year grant's done or the 3-year. We have to be focused on the long game and be continual and intentional about that. So if you're ready, let's let the shift begin. Now, we're going to highlight a 4-part process. And some of you, hopefully it's not new to you. We're not the creators of many of these concepts. We're just packaging it in a way that we feel from our experience makes it doable, that we can actually start changing the structure. So as we go through this, you're going to hopefully say, oh yeah, we do some of that. And I want you to see it as part of a process and how you can actually leverage what you've already been doing or start to do that to make this shift happen. So let's start with part 1 of the process, building community. Now this is sequential in how to do it, meaning that if you've already done this as we go through, you're like, oh yeah, we've been doing that. We're really good at that. Well, great, because this is the foundation for all shifting of power, is that there's got to be a strong community foundation. And how that happens is by facilitating. Again, what you're facilitating is relationship building. Now, often you'll have neighbors or community groups that are in their own apartments doing their own thing. One group's competing against another for resources. Our job as nonprofit members and others in this work is to help connect those people, have them know each other on a different level, facilitate conversations, facilitate group discussions. And that can also involve organization to organization. You know, why should the executive director of one organization be talking to me and I'm telling him about another executive director? Let's have them connect and work together. Why should one food service director who's doing great work, I'm the one who's interacting and learning everything from them, and then I'm talking to another school district? Our job is to build relationships between those folks. City planners around policy, let's connect the people to build their own communities and know each other, so we as nonprofits don't have to be the arbiter of power and the arbiter of information. So that connectivity and making connections is a big, big role we can play. And a lot of time goes in that. It doesn't really necessarily like, wow, I'm going to write that in a grant and check that box. It doesn't necessarily work in the structures we have. We have to shift that. And information sharing. You know, you go into your community, there's experts in everything, everywhere. You've got people who are, you know, I'm a manager at Walmart, you know, I work in a hardware store, I work at a farm, you know, I'm a laborer and I know how to do irrigation. We want to make sure that we're connecting those people and saying, hey, everybody in your community, look what they know. Look what they know. These are the people. We want to make sure everybody has the same information. They don't have to come to us. We don't have to hold the information. We need to make sure that the people in our communities have the information. And then once we know who's got the experience and the wisdom and the skills in communities, we want to elevate those so people look and go, oh, right, it's in our own community. It's not necessarily in that organization or that organization. So that's really key about community building, relationships, connections, information, and then elevating those experiences. And once you've done that, then you can bring your community together and say, what is important to you? What are your common values? Not that, you know, the USDA put out something that says what's important to them, and therefore we're going to fulfill a program by writing a grant for it. No, what does the community say they want? What's important to them? What are their values? So our job is facilitating those discussions. So this is key about part one. If you haven't done this and you haven't done it enough, to get out of looking at us determining what's important, but determining what they find is important. Part two, once you've built that community, we have to find out what is the community, what are their assets, and then what do they need actually to be able to do the work they want. So if they desire, they say, hey, you know, our values, we really want to see more access to food in our neighborhood. People aren't getting the healthy food they want. Well, our job can be helping uncover, well, what's the outcome of that value? Well, they might say, well, we want a community garden, or we want a healthy corner store, or we want to see more food in our schools. It's up to them to come up with their outcome, and up to us to help uncover that based on the values that they've already determined in step one. Now, once you've done that, then it's all easy. It's backwards planning. Well, great, if that's what the community values and that's what the community wants, what do they have already? What are their resources and skills? And then what do they need to be self-sustaining and getting to that outcome? Again, this is all community focused, not on us focus. So if the community says, wow, we have people that are really good, we want to do community garden. I've got this guy, he knows how to do irrigation. These guys are great at soil. This person has been great at propagating seeds. Great, they have that, but you know what? We have no idea how to run a good meeting and have people work cooperatively in this garden. Okay, good, that's a skill you need. And then determine what you and your organization need to do to shift power to the community. Ask yourself, how many of you spend time organizing a meeting for a community on the phone, calling people? Why are you doing that? Somebody in the community member needs to be recruited into that. If they don't know how to do it, you can help them figure out and train them. The more things you can figure out, look at every single thing we do as a nonprofit and say, do we need to be doing that? Can't somebody in the community be doing that? And then how do we help them do that, which we'll get to next? Because remember, whoever does the work owns it. If I build the community garden and my organization builds a community garden, it's my garden. If the neighborhood builds the community garden and pulls the resources and pulls the skills together, it's their garden. So that's key, is going through this. So we've built community. We've assessed what the needs are and the assets are in the community. Part three is now it's time, as our role to shift is to mobilize the resources and the skills. So if they say, you know what, we want this, we've talked, we've looked at everybody in the neighborhood, the community, we need help advocating. We don't know how to do that. I had never talked with a community politician or the policymakers. We're having conflicts. We're not sure how to manage finances. We don't have those skills. After we've uncovered those needs, it's our job to bring the trainings and help bring those skills to the community. Resources, we have great access generally in this group to money, land, equipment. We get those and we figure out how do we shift those into the community's hands rather than hold on to them. Does it all have, do we have to own everything? We can shift that, and we'll talk about how you do that. Building support networks. We don't want to, in the long run, be the people who are always pulling the trainings together, helping them get the resources. If there's one group that's doing really well at it and another not so well, we want to connect those two and have them help each other, because guaranteed situations over time will change, so we can be backing out of being the support network. So we want to find those folks and keep that connection going. And then this was a great conversation that's been going on in the chat, and I was really happy to see it. Value people's time. We want to value it, whatever that looks like, with stipends, with continuing education units for people who are in maybe school districts or food service. People talked about different ways. There's a whole great list of suggestions going on in the chat box. So I really want to talk about that and emphasize that more than ever is we get paid to show up at a training. Our time is valued, but we ask people to take their own time for free and show up to these things. Our work is to find the money, to work with funders, to talk to others and say, look, if we're going to be transferring these skills, we need to value people's time. And that can be childcare, somebody was talking about. There was a lot of different ways. Whatever it is, find out how people value their time and find the resources to do it. It's the game changer on power shifting because we can't keep expecting people to show up for free. So I just threw a lot at you, part 1, 2, and 3. So there's a lot there. So I want you to take a moment to reflect. And actually, we're just going to, at this point, we're going to kind of have it put it in the chat box, and already things are happening there. I want you to think, many of you have already been doing this in your community. It was great to seeing something about compensating. What processes have you done in your community around building community, assessing your community's skills and needs, and then mobilizing those resources? Or how could you? So let's just kind of throw out some things. People pull up the chat box, look at those. Jen will kind of share some of those out loud for those that are on the phone or don't have access to the chat box as we go through.
Someone wrote community ambassadors. I'd like to hear more about what that means.
Great, using fiscal sponsorships to help people in the community actually have some of those resources they need. Using community advisory committees to actually build, having them share their values, what they want. Bringing community members and decision makers together in the same workshop so they can actually advocate, making those connections yourself. You can do that work rather than being the arbiter of that power.
So it's providing administrative support.
Peer counseling, like BIPOC farmer peer counseling to advise in lending policies, great. Peer programs, having them talk to each other with you facilitating it. Resident-led steering committees. Great, so people are doing this. Again, we might be affirming what you're doing, and we want to see that these are suggestions for others to go, oh, right, we could be doing more of that. Get out of the office, and that's another thing. Too often people say, hey, the community didn't show up. Well, where did you have the meeting? Was it your meeting in your space, or was it their meeting in their space that you showed up to? There's a big difference in that. So we really need to get out of our offices and out of our heads into their spaces and support them.
I like that someone wrote pass-through funding with no restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. Again, people are using continuing education units. That's something that we've done where you go out and actually, you have to work with the universities to set that up with a school district, but that's a role that a nonprofit can do that finds value and can get compensated for people who work in the education world in particular. They get compensation, their salaries go up by actually participating in yours. So there's great ways and lots of examples of how that works on that. Okay, so part 4, we talked about building community, assessing what resources and skills your community has, mobilizing those things, how you compensate people for their time. Now maybe the most challenging part for some people, and this comes back often to our ego and the structures we inherited, is part 4, and it's the most important part to shifting power.
Going away for a while, or maybe forever. And it's sometimes a hard concept to, as Miles said, to kind of grapple with. It's just kind of like allowing people to do what they need to do, and someone mentioned in their own time frame, which can be, challenging as well. And I'm sorry, I got kind of caught up in the chat there for a minute, but we need to, check our urge to go in and fix things right away. Like, I know that I've definitely dealt with this, especially with large grants where I feel like there's a lot of pressure and a lot of things at stake. Like, we have to get this right, and or I'm going to get in trouble, or, someone's going to get in trouble, or we're going to do it wrong, and I'm going to get punished or something, or our organization's going to get punished for not doing it right. But we need to give people space to be in it and see what's working, what's not working. How can we be of help, and kind of let things emerge. And to begin to have those, people have been mentioning it, but having those conversations with our funders and supporters and our boards about, you know, how do we begin to, you know, value this relationship building piece, this community building piece more, so that it's not this like automatic narrative that like it's not appreciated, it's not funded, it's not sexy, it's, you know, it's like we need to start educating you know, these people so that we're in the same conversation, and setting realistic outcomes with them. And then framing any challenges as insights. And again, this is that kind of white supremacist, you know, structure where it's like we do wrong things, and so then it's bad, and not appreciating the fact that like this is how we learn, you know, that you know, if someone's having, you know, a community garden's having issues with conflict management, it's like, it's not a problem. It's just, here's an opportunity as a facilitator to come in and say, whoa, you know, what do you guys need? How can I help? You know, maybe there's that help word again. But, you know, how can I be a resource for you? Or you know, do you need a training? You know, what can I bring in? But just reframing that and not seeing things as bad or good. And then preparing for your next step. So maybe that means, you know, rethinking your organization. You know, someone mentioned earlier on, like, okay, well, if we all go away and this is all, you know, all of our missions have come to reality, well, isn't there going to be an opportunity for some tending? And it's like, well, yeah, but that's a redesign. It's a rethinking of like how our organization functions. What are we doing? You know, making space for that, preparing for that, maybe preparing for, you know, like, wow, I really, you know, feel like I engaged in this process. I've completed something. Maybe it's time to go try something else out in my life. But just making space for that, and like having it be something, again, that is a part of the process, that we're planning for obsolescence. And that means, well, maybe we're not needed anymore. So what does that look like? So, as we mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to just be challenging our thinking, and obviously from the chat box, everyone's in this, you know, we're all in this conversation. But, you know, what's emerging as a challenge to the way you do your work as an individual or an organization? You know, especially like in terms of like the long game, or, you know, just any of the concepts and ideas that we've been bringing up today. What's emerging as a challenge for you? So share with us in the chat box.
Yeah, we'll take a few minutes for you to just reflect on that and think about this, because we're kind of moving into wrapping up today. So we've kind of thrown a lot of concepts about what do we have to acknowledge and release, kind of a process for starting that shift. So as we're preparing to kind of bring today to a close and get ready for our session 2, what's being challenged? How are you being challenged by these concepts, or how are you being challenged by this discussion, or your organization being challenged? So we can really start addressing that as we move into examples and how to move forward.
I'm seeing a lot of challenges with getting funders on board with, you know, the conversation, a true transfer of resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, having the funding, resources, and knowledge to carry through on community desires.
Mm-hmm.
Difficult to change the economic supremacy in our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is that long haul piece, you know, and it needs to be intentional, and it needs to be continually designed in a continual discussion that we're having. We can't. It's very easy to fall back into the structures and the systems that are already there, because, you know, there's the urgency to it. We have to keep going. Everybody around is it, but we have to, you know, designing a new program is a great way to start. Redesigning can be challenged, but it's necessary. But whenever a new opportunity comes, it's like, whoa, 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 let's stop and talk about how we're going to do this. And I want to address that idea of funders. And we'll come back to this again too, is there's a hook that you have with every funder, because guaranteed 99% of the grant applications anybody's ever filled out, the last throwaway thing that they always say, and it's a throwaway because they see it as a throwaway, is how will your project be sustainable once the funding runs out, right? You know, I see heads nodding. People have, this is it, right? And we always throw some throwaway. Oh, we're going to do this, this, and this, but we know they don't care because it's just not built in. Well, if you want to say, you want to know how this is done, is I need more money, that goes to pay people to attend the training. I need time to build relationships. I need time to work with and build the capacity of the community and not the capacity of myself and my organization. So those conversations, you have a way in with every funder to have that conversation, because they all want to know, how is it sustainable? And it isn't sustainable with the current system we have. Other things that are key things, I think, well, maybe at this point, based on time, I want to sort of move us into holding this space. There's lots of great chat going on. Keep throwing down what you're doing. And I want to talk about where we're going to go in session 2. This is a 2 for those of you who might have just joined in and weren't aware. This is a 2-session training. So today, we've really been talking about kind of those framing and setting the stage for doing the shift and what needs to happen. And then we're going to meet again next week. So I want to talk about where this is going, what you can be doing in the meantime, and what to expect next. Jen, you want to?
Sure. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people are asking, you know, am I going to get the slides? Are we going to see the chat and all that? And the answer is yes. So I will address what resources you're going to get on the next slide. So this is day 1, and day 2 is next week, same time, same channel, and you should have the Zoom link for that. And then we're going to be moving from these concepts into action. So what does that really look like? And for those of you who arrived late, we'll be sharing examples from our community in rural Northern California, Mendocino County, 3 different programs. One is a food hub program, one is a farm to school program, and one is a community garden program. And we're going to be illustrating how these concepts have kind of played out in that work. And then we're going to look at your programs. So we're going to give you all a worksheet and you'll get it in advance. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But we're going to start looking at, like, how do you design and or redesign for this obsolescence? And you know, we have kind of a step-by-step worksheet that we're going to all go through and have time to kind of work in group like we did today, and really explore this in more depth. And so before next week happens, you guys are going to get another email from the Wallace Center and the Food Systems Leadership Network, and it's going to include an evaluation. You're going to get a four-part process cheat sheet. So it'll have, like, it's almost like a little bookmark, or you can like hang it on your wall. You're going to get an advanced copy of the worksheet. Now, the worksheet can be printed, which I know is kind of old school to write on, or you can use Adobe Acrobat and do fill and sign, and you can use it digitally, but you don't need to do anything in advance with it. We're going to go through it. We're going to give you time next week as individuals to do some work on it, and then we're going to go through it together afterwards and have time for that. And as I said too, you'll get the slides, a copy of the recording, and the chat box. Anything else, Annalena?
Annalena, yeah, you want to talk about a little bit with the website and maybe where some of the slides and recording, where that'll live?
Yeah, sure. You pretty much summed it all up, so thank you, Jen. But we will be sending through a link to the recording, the chat box, and the resources that Jen mentioned here in an email probably tomorrow, and then again next week. And everything will be also linked on the FSLN website, and so and that link will be distributed in that email as well. So everything will be in one place, and to keep it easy for you guys.
Yeah, and one of the things we want to keep in mind is what this objective is. So to shift or affirm your program and project design thinking to be community driven. And I know there's been a lot of talk in the chat too about, like, well, my community is tired. They don't want to own more things. They don't want to take on more stuff. And totally get that. And we're hoping that in the examples that we're sharing, we'll share kind of how you know, we're not working to put more work on people and to make it seem like some onerous thing, but for it to become more about the way a community functions, and it just becomes.
And when we talk about that, just briefly, when we talk about that internalized oppression that a lot of people have taken on, and when we also talk about the ego that brings us that sense of satisfaction, feeling good, being recognized for doing good work, tired people who have been internalized repression, when their ego starts changing around ownership, it's very powerful to see a community own something, and that satisfaction that comes with being in charge of something, claiming success, being recognized. So yes, there's an exhaustion with being oppressed. There's exhaustion with this. It's not to deny it. There's exhaustion without having privilege. But by shifting and beginning the shift, it doesn't happen necessarily overnight, but by beginning that, it starts to shift the energy of one from being pushed down to one to lifting up. So hold that thought, think about your program. Great stuff still coming out in the chat box. We're going to let that run for 1 more minute so we can officially be on time. And we look forward, please, if you're ready to take these concepts to action, please come back next week. I know it's a two-week commitment. And thank you so much to the Wallace Center and for everybody who's been on here and really sharing some fantastic discussion, some fantastic concepts for such a large group of people. Take care, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.